Hi everyone, and thank you for coming to watch this presentation in which I'm going to be using evidence from the Egyptian language to investigate whether the so-called linguistic cycle pattern is actually a real cycle. This is part of my PhD research in which I'm looking at the linguistic cycle pattern in Egyptian verbal constructions, and as well as discussing to what extent this pattern is actually a cycle in this talk, I'll also be looking a bit at how similar it is across different verbal constructions. So to start with, what is the linguistic cycle? Well, this is a diachronic linguistic pattern which involves the alternation between synthetic forms and analytic forms, with the full cycle being the change from analytic to analytic, or the opposite, from synthetic to analytic to synthetic. And to define synthetic and analytic in a linguistic context, Schregler gives the definition of synthetic as the interdependency of morphemes within a speech unit, and analytic as the autonomy of morphemes within a speech unit. Although at a basic level, what this essentially means is that a synthetic form would use one word, where an analytic form would use several, which you can see here in the difference between the synthetic ancient Greek form, palso, which uses one word, and its English equivalent, I am going to stop, which uses 5. So essentially, synthetic forms use less elements and are less separable, whereas more analytic forms use more elements, which can be separated by other words. The linguistic cycle is referred to as a cycle due to the repeating nature of the analytic and synthetic stages. A full completion of the cycle involves forms of a construction beginning as synthetic, becoming more analytic, and then becoming synthetic once again, or alternatively going from analytic to synthetic to analytic. However, the labeling of this as a cycle rather implies that the return to a synthetic stage in a synthetic analytic synthetic cycle, which is the one that occurs most often in Egyptian, is a return to the place that the cycle started in. However, in reality, these stages are not necessarily true reflections of one another. So in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be using evidence from Egyptian verbal constructions to investigate how similar the supposedly matching stages actually are, and what this evidence suggests about whether the linguistic cycle is a true cycle. The fact that the developments of Egyptian verbal constructions exhibit the linguistic cycle pattern has been known since at least 1970 from a rather brief article by Hodge. The linguistic cycle occurs in the developments of each and every construction, and in the majority of cases, this involves the development of a synthetic form to an analytic form to another synthetic form, so involving two synthetic stages which can be compared. A few constructions show a more extended version of the linguistic cycle, such as the negative habitual and negative future constructions, which each have an additional analytic stage in their developments, or the past construction, which has both an extra analytic stage and an extra synthetic stage. Each of these then allows the comparison of their two analytic stages as well as their synthetic stages. But since all constructions have at least two synthetic stages, my comparison will start with those. One of the features of synthetic forms is that the elements within them are typically inseparable. For example, we can see this in the future construction, in which the earliest synthetic form, sejameth, in this form, the two elements of the verb and the subject are inseparable when you have a pronominal subject. So in this example, the verb inet and the subject ek are together, with other things such as the object and indirect object coming after this group. And this was also the case in the forms for the second synthetic stage of the future construction. So in this example, you can see that the particle and the conjunction in the sentence are unable to interrupt the group of the future construction. So this inseparability shows that in this respect, the two synthetic stages of the future construction are the same. However, synthetic verbal constructions weren't always as fully inseparable as those of the future. For example, in the first synthetic stage of negative verbal forms, the negative marker tended to be separable from the rest of the construction. And we can see this in the earliest attested form of the negative past, in which the negative marker n could be separated from the sejameth section of the construction by particles, or also when the negation n-zep was used with the additional zep separating n from sejameth. However, in the second synthetic stage of this construction, the element providing negation could no longer be separated from the rest of the construction, as you can see from the example here, where the particle day comes after the entirety of the negative past construction. So here the two synthetic stages are not identical in this respect, since the second form is less separable and consequently more synthetic than the first. Another way in which we can compare synthetic forms is through the quantity of the elements that they contain. So the more elements a form contains, the more analytic it is, and the less elements it contains, the more synthetic it is. Of the 17 verbal constructions that I've looked at, only 2 contain the same number of elements in their 2 synthetic forms. The first of these, the present construction, is very straightforward since it only has 2 elements in its 2 synthetic forms. In its earliest form, we can separate out the elements of the content verb, here represented by sejm, and the subject, which is here represented by f. And we can see that in the latest form, f sotum, it contains the exact same 2 elements, with the content verb here represented by sotum, which is the same verb as sejm, just having gone through a few developments of its own, and the subject still represented by f. And for anyone who's not familiar, this letter is just the way that f is written in the Coptic alphabet. So from this, we can see that both synthetic forms of the present had 2 elements, the content verb and the subject. The other construction, which has the same number of elements in both its synthetic forms, is the terminative. In its earliest form, this construction contained 4 elements, the preposition are, the content verb, a verb ending t, and the subject. The Coptic forms of this construction also contain 4 elements, although these are not all identical to the earlier ones, as was the case in the present construction. The first element is no longer the preposition are, which has been lost from the construction, but is now sha, a grammaticalized form of the preposition sha, which was added to the construction in late Egyptian. And after that, the second element is a descendant of the verb ending t, which is no longer a verb ending since it's not attached to a verb, but has become part of the prefix. And in some Coptic dialects, we also have an n added to this element. Then the third element is the subject, and the final element is the content verb. So we can see that this construction has an identical number of elements in its 2 most synthetic forms, but not all of these elements themselves are identical. Every other construction has a different quantity of elements making up the forms in each of their synthetic stages, primarily with a higher quantity in the second synthetic form than in the first one. For most of these, the later form contained 1 more element than the earlier one. For example, the earliest synthetic form of the not yet construction, and sejemetef, contains 4 elements, the negative marker n, the content verb, the verb ending t, and the subject, while the later synthetic form had 5 elements. And these were the negative marker, which would then become emper, an auxiliary a, the old verb ending t, which was now part of the auxiliary, the subject, and the content verb. So in this construction, the additional element originated from the addition of an auxiliary in the creation of the form bu eret f sejm, where the verb ir was added as an auxiliary and later became a in Coptic. We can also see this in the development of the temporal construction. This construction has gained 2 extra elements in its latest synthetic form in comparison to its earlier one of which came from the addition of the verb ir as an auxiliary, which then became re in Coptic. And the temporal gained its other new element through the addition of the preposition creating the compound preposition jer to help express the temporal meaning, rather than just having the simple preposition jer. And these 2 prepositions were then used in every subsequent form of the temporal construction, with a few changes until its final synthetic form. So although I don't have time to go through for every construction, I can tell you that every construction which has more elements in its later synthetic form than its earlier one has gained 1 element from the addition of an auxiliary, while a couple also add extra elements, as we've just seen in the temporal construction. The addition of an auxiliary also changes the way that the meanings of the constructions are expressed, as in the earliest form it's the inflection of the content verb which expresses things such as the tense and aspect of the construction, but after the addition of an auxiliary, it's the auxiliary which expresses such things, while the content verb is in an uninflected infinitive form. This change from the addition of an auxiliary is also seen in the present and terminative constructions. The terminative adds the verb ir as an auxiliary, while the present adds the preposition her. However, both of these are lost later in the development of the constructions, hence them having the same quantity of elements in both synthetic forms. However, the addition of the auxiliaries caused the content verb to appear in the infinitive form in both constructions, so they're no longer using inflection to express things such as tense and aspect, but instead these are unmarked in the present and taken on by the element sha'a in the terminative. So despite the fact that the loss of the auxiliary element in both the present and the terminative constructions meant that they contained an equal quantity of elements in their respective earliest and latest synthetic forms, the addition of an auxiliary in the first place ensured that the later synthetic form of each construction used a different method for expressing the semantic properties of the construction. The addition of an auxiliary in every construction also caused another change, which is a change in word order from verb-subject to subject-verb. And the present construction is the clearest example of this, since its synthetic forms only contain these two elements. But this occurs in every construction, as in the examples here of the optative and also the habitual. And this change in word order occurs when an auxiliary is added to the construction. And since when the auxiliary was added, when it was verbal in origin, it took the form previously used by the content verb, which the subject had immediately followed. And so, as I mentioned before, it took on the tense and aspect of the construction, but it also took on the subject as its own. And since the auxiliary and subject now couldn't really be separated, particularly when a suffix pronoun was used, and with the content verb's new role as a complement of the auxiliary, the content verb moved to the end of the construction into the position of the complement after the subject, and causing a change in word order. When the auxiliary that was added was prepositional in origin rather than verbal, it was the construction that the new form was based on, which determined the word order. So the EUF SEGEM form of the present construction and the similar future form, EUF RSEGEM, and their respective isomorphic negations were all based on the nonverbal location pattern, which was formed with the subject followed by a preposition and then a noun phrase. Since in the verbal constructions which were created using this pattern, the content verb took the place of the noun phrase, this gave them a word order in which the subject came before the verb. The new word order created by the addition of an auxiliary was then maintained in each construction throughout any further developments, and consequently later synthetic forms had a different word order to the earlier ones. The only construction in which this was not the case was the past construction. This is the only Egyptian verbal construction which shows three synthetic stages within its development, which were Sejam F, and Afsoten. And as I'm sure you can see, these two Sejam F forms seem to be exactly the same, and certainly have the same word order. It's been suggested that the development of the later Sejam F form could be due to the loss of EU and N from the form that appeared between these two Sejam Fs, or due to a revival of the first Sejam F form. But either way, they look pretty identical in the written language. The creation of the third synthetic form of the past shows a more similar pattern to other constructions, however, with the addition of an auxiliary causing a change in word order between Sejam F and Afsoten. So what this shows us is that the change in word order is not required with every repetition of the linguistic cycle, but instead seems to occur only once in the development of Egyptian verbal constructions. Since the past construction has three synthetic stages, it also follows that it has two analytic stages between these. And the only other two constructions which have two analytic stages are the negative future and negative habitual. So these are the three constructions I'll be using to compare analytic forms. And looking at the different word orders, like we saw in synthetic forms, we can also see this change from verb subject to subject verb in the analytic stages of the past and negative habitual constructions. In each of these, the second analytic form is the first form in the development of the construction to have the auxiliary which is added, which is what makes it more analytic than the construction's previous form. And so it's the first form to show the changed word order, which is then maintained throughout the rest of the construction's development. And consequently, the analytic forms of these two constructions have different word orders. However, within the negative future construction, it was in the creation of the first analytic form that the change in word order occurred, caused by the addition of R to become an auxiliary. And as with other constructions, this word order was then maintained throughout the rest of the negative future construction's development, and consequently the second analytic form had the same word order as the first analytic form. And then looking at the quantity of elements in each analytic form, and starting with the past construction, we can see that the earlier analytic form contained 4 elements, while the later one contained 3. So in this case, the later analytic form contained fewer elements than the earlier one. And this contrasts with the synthetic stages I mentioned before, where when the two synthetic forms of a construction contained different quantities of elements, the later form contained more elements than the earlier one. However, the quantities of elements in the two analytic forms of the past construction still show that these forms are not identical in this respect, with the greater number of elements in the EU Segem form making it more analytic than the later IRF Segem form. But in contrast to the past construction, the negative future and negative habitual constructions have the same number of elements in their two analytic stages. Each of the negative habituals analytic forms has 4 elements, while each of the negative futures has 5. So the analytic forms within each construction are identical in this respect. However, the types of elements which make up each analytic form within each construction aren't all identical. In the negative habitual, the verb ending used in the first analytic form is swapped for an auxiliary in the second, while the negative future gained a negative marker, having 2 in its second analytic form, but only 1 in its first, but had 1 less marker of futurity, having used both EU and R in its first analytic form, but only NA in its second. So while the two analytic forms in each of the negative habitual and negative future constructions contained identical numbers of elements, these elements not only look different, but perform different roles. So back to the question of whether the linguistic cycle is really a cycle. The only example in Egyptian verbal constructions which shows a return to an identical form is in the 2 Segem forms of the past construction. So this is the only case in which we might consider the linguistic cycle to be truly cyclical. In all other constructions, and even within the final synthetic stage and analytic stage of the past construction, the various synthetic and analytic stages of each construction show differences in how synthetic or analytic they were. For example, with the greater quantity of elements found in later synthetic forms of most constructions, making these less synthetic than the earlier synthetic forms, or the greater level of separability seen in the earlier synthetic forms of certain constructions in comparison to that of the later forms, making the earlier forms less synthetic in this particular respect. Furthermore, the change in word order and the different types of elements used in different forms shows that even in forms with the same level of syntheticity, they were different from one another. So while it is possible to establish alternating stages of increases in analyticity and syntheticity within each construction, the differences between what might be labelled as analytic and synthetic stages might mean that a better description for this pattern is that it shows the alternation between the processes of analyticization and syntheticization. And in terms of its name, something like spiral is possibly a better label than cycle. Thank you for watching.